Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. Well, in our most recent lesson, I introduced the grammatical concept of parallelism, describing this as the rule that has to do with creating lists of items and sentences. We examined the idea that the first item in a list of items sets a rule for the list, establishing the type of item that must follow in all remaining items in the list in order for the sentence to be considered grammatically correct. We focused our attention on example sentences that included three different kinds of items: nouns, adjectives, and verbs. And we looked at one particular complication that can arise when listing verbs. Specifically, we learned that listing verbs requires you to make sure that the verbs you list are in the same tense and conjugated for the same subject. As I mentioned at the end of the lesson, though, grammatical parallelism gets even a bit more complicated than that. It gets more complicated when we are not only listing individual parts of speech, but also creating relationships between phrases and clauses in sentences. That last sentence that I just said is a perfect example of what I mean. Could you notice the parallelism in the sentence? Here, I'll say it again so you can take a closer look. It gets more complicated when we are not only listing individual parts of speech, but also creating relationships between phrases and clauses and sentences. See any parallel structure in there? The parallelism is a bit hidden, but it's in there. It comes in the not only, but also idiomatic structure. Guess what? When we use idiomatic structures such as either or, neither nor, and not only but also, we must make sure that the items we place into these idiomatic structures are parallel to each other. What comes after the beginning of the structure not only must be parallel to what comes after the ending of the structure but also. And in fact, in my example sentence, I've created a correct parallel structure by using a verb in each of these two positions. Not only have I used a verb, but I have also made sure to use a verb in the same form, the ing form. Even more specifically, these two verbs form part of a verb phrase involving multiple words. This means that my complicated structure is parallel. Consider another example with the idiomatic structure neither nor. Here it is. The child was neither in the closet nor on the bed. See what I've done there? I have a neither nor structure, and I have made sure to use a phrase after each the neither and the nor. In fact, I have made sure to use the same type of phrase after each element in the idiomatic structure. In the closet and on the bed are both prepositional phrases. Note that I don't need to use the same preposition in the prepositional phrases in order for my structure to be parallel. It's enough that I have a prepositional phrase following the neither and a prepositional phrase following the nor for my sentence structure to be parallel. Or take the idiomatic structure either or. You will also need a parallel structure following the either and the or. For example, you will either finish your homework or not perform up to expectations on the test. Here, we have the verb finish coming after the word either and another conjugated verb perform after the word or. The parallelism works well. Not only do we have two conjugated verbs, but we also have two conjugated verbs matched with the same subject. All three of the idiomatic structures that I've just introduced have the same basic concept. After the first and after the second components of the structures, you must have items that match in terms of parallelism. Sometimes it is tempting to use a phrase in a parallel structure when it is not appropriate to do so. For instance, a prepositional phrase can communicate the same idea as an adjective, and in this regard, you may want to introduce a prepositional phrase into a list of adjectives, but you must be careful here. Prepositional phrases cannot be used in lists of adjectives while maintaining a correct parallel structure. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Here it is. The investor's advice was timely, specific, and of great value. The first two items in the list set the rule for the list. Timely and specific are both adjectives. So we need to finish the list with an adjective. But what do we get instead? A prepositional phrase, of great value. That is not correct. You should use an adjective there instead. Valuable does all the work you need it to do. The revised sentence should be, the investor's advice was timely, specific, and valuable. So far in this lesson, we've been looking at how to use phrases in parallel structures. You can also use clauses in lists. Have you ever heard Caesar's famous saying, Veni, Vidi, Vici? I came, I saw, I conquered. The clauses in the list all follow the same structure, and the force of this famous sentence comes from its succinct repetitions of the same syntax. Or imagine a tennis player after a long match. He was hungry, he was thirsty, he was exhausted. Here we have three clauses with subject-verb pairs that emphasize the fatigue of the tennis player after the match. The repetition of the clause structure helps to drive home the point about the player's physical state. Whether you are listing parts of speech, phrases, or clauses, the same basic idea applies. Listing in English grammar requires you to set a certain rule and then follow that rule. Knowing where the rule is established is a skill in itself. In any list, I generally like to look at what is happening immediately after the commas that separate the items in the list. These commas are there to show you the separation of the items, so looking immediately after the commas will generally indicate to you whether you have a list of, say, nouns or verbs. That's where the rules are established for the items in the list. Once you know what the rule is, then it becomes much easier to determine whether all of the items in the list follow the same rule. The lists that I have mentioned to this point have generally come near the ends of the sentences in which they appear. This does not necessarily need to be the case. Subjects at the beginning of sentences can also consist of lists. Consider this final example for the day. Doing work you love, making a difference for others, and earning enough money are all important career goals. In this sentence, I have used a list of ing words as the subject of my sentence. Notice the parallel structure. The items being listed are doing, making, and earning. That works well because we have 3 words in exactly the same form. And the conjugated verb in my sentence, are, is plural because the subject of the sentence has not 1, not 2, but 3 elements. Learning to list items properly is one of the most important skills you can learn in order to elevate your English. Using multiple items in a list can increase the sophistication of your writing, making your English more efficient in the process. That said, it is also important not to overuse parallel structures. When I am editing my own writing, I often come across pockets of sentences that all use parallelism. As with everything in English language writing, moderation is key. Don't use any one structure too often, or your writing will come to sound tired and boring. The essential thing is to vary your sentence structures constantly, keeping in mind that simple, direct sentences pack the most power. In our next lesson, we'll build on what we've learned about parallel structure by looking at a specific application of the idea. This application involves comparisons between items. Want to say that one person is taller than another? That a certain shirt is better looking than another one? Believe it or not, you'll be using the rules of parallelism to do so. We'll spend 2 lessons on the topic of comparisons so that you can see the full extent of the application of parallelism in this critical area. By the time we're finished, you'll be a pro at creating lists of comparative items, even when those items involve more complex structures such as phrases and clauses. We'll wrap up there for the day. Until next time, my friends, spread the word.